I'm in the middle of going through a major water remediation in my basement. That's why the walls are ripped up behind me, since I had a bunch of water come in through this window back here after it pooled up next to my sewer line because there was a hole in the sewer line. So a bunch of sump pump water that got pumped through this sewer line right here pooled up next to the window. And because we had such an intense storm, it was a lot of water all at once. So it was pumped through the sump pump and it ended up coming through the window. We had to rip out the whole basement, do all this water remediation and stuff to prevent mold growth, and also just repair everything that was damaged by the water. Funny thing about real estate in that it's a bunch of not waterproof things directly next to a bunch of water carrying items like pipes and all of that stuff, pipes and drains. So if anything goes wrong with the plumbing system, or even in this case, if anything goes wrong with the plumbing system and then comes through some weak points in the building, all of a sudden you're in a world of hurt because nothing is really waterproof. All in all, it's going to cost me thousands of dollars. How much will depend on how much insurance covers, but in any event, we have to repair the sewer line itself. That's going to involve ripping up some concrete to get to that sewer line. We also have the actual basement remediation, water remediation. That cost a few grand right there. Then it's actually putting everything back together, patching this drywall up. We actually found this foundation crack right here, which has since been epoxied. It's a pretty old crack. It didn't seem to be causing any sort of problems, but we wanted to do a little bit of preventative maintenance in case it didn't lead to some sort of leak in the future, but didn't look like it was. Anyways, fact of the matter is, real estate can be very, very expensive. So much so that it scares a lot of people away, and rightfully so. If you don't have a lot of money coming into real estate, it's going to be very nerve-wracking because something like this can always pop up. I mean, just within a month of buying this property, I had this issue come up. Within 2 weeks of actually moving into it, since it's an owner-occupied deal, we'll eventually turn it into a rental when we move out to some other place to take advantage of that great owner-occupied financing. But it's expensive nonetheless, and you got to be ready for those sorts of things. If you don't have a lot of cash, then real estate is a very dangerous thing to get into because you never know when something like this is going to happen, and you're going to be the one who has to pay for it. Even if insurance covers this particular problem that I'm having right now, I'm still going to have to pay my deductible, which is going to be a few grand. So even in the best case scenario where my insurance company pays for the vast majority of the expenses, I'm still coming out of pocket a few grand. That's on top of all the ongoing maintenance that you're going to have with the property. It's a real thing and it requires real care. It's not as simple as buying a stock in some company where you're not actually running the company, someone else is. It's much more passive that way. There are plenty of drawbacks associated with that, which we'll get to in a second, but it's definitely a real concern with real estate. It's hard because if you don't have a substantial sort of handyman background or some sort of skilled contractor type trade that's under your belt, it's going to be pretty intimidating starting out because there are a lot of problems that could come up without really any notice because things break. Real estate is man-made. We're not talking about land here, but even land could have its problems that you really couldn't control. But the buildings themselves definitely have a useful life. They're not going to last forever, and you're going to have to maintain them. Things are going to break inevitably, and sometimes the breakages are very expensive. Sometimes they're much more manageable, and they can be made more manageable with careful discipline and saving and maintaining reserves throughout your property's life as you're holding it. You got to look at the opportunity cost of your time. Would it be worth you trying to figure out how to repair something? Ultimately, you can learn pretty much everything in real estate and how to do it yourself, but is it really worth your time if your skill is in some other area that's worth putting that time towards it? Not to mention, you should have recourse if someone else does the project. They're going to have an insurance policy or should have insurance. And if they do a poor job and you can actually go after them, you have some recourse there. But if you do it yourself, it's totally on you. And that is something to keep in mind. Now, I'm not saying that's a likely thing that would happen, but sticking with this theme of the difficulties of real estate, that is an added layer of difficulty. You're managing people and people can make mistakes. And then you're trying to figure out how to solve those mistakes, not just the initial breakage or the initial problem that you had to try to bring that person out to solve. That can sometimes lead to new problems. Or even better, you discover new problems as you're solving one, then all of a sudden the problem seems much greater than it initially was, and it's just adding insult to injury. But then at that point, you'd rather make that discovery earlier so you can actually take care of it. But it's going to be very expensive in that case because the problem is being magnified. If you don't know about a problem earlier rather than later, all of a sudden that problem can really compound over the long term, and then it is a much more expensive problem, or it leads to other problems with the property that then you're going to have to fix. Otherwise, you're going to be in some serious trouble because you might put other people at risk if you have tenants in the building, or yourself at risk, and you certainly wouldn't want to do that. So this begs the question, is real estate worth the hassle, worth the mental energy? If you're actually putting the time towards it yourself and you're making the repairs yourself, is it worth your time and the mental energy and all that other stuff? This is a question that goes very much to your personal values, but you have to make sure that you look at the benefits of real estate too. It's very easy to focus on the obvious disadvantages, the obvious costs. In this case, the obvious disadvantage is that I have to deal with this real problem. This water damage is here, and I have to take care of it. It's not going to disappear. No one else is going to do it. Well, I could hire someone else to do it, but it ultimately falls on me. It is my thing that I own. You could really say this about any sort of business that you run. If you have a problem in a business that you are running yourself, you're going to have to jump on those problems and take care of them. With real estate, it is effectively a type of business. You're owning this asset, and that asset throws off cash flow that you produce by providing a service, which is to provide housing, and ideally high quality housing relative to the price point. And as a property owner, as a landlord, it's in your interest to take care of this property so you can provide that high level of housing service so that you could command not only top rents, but also keep your customers, that being your tenants, or I suppose if you're a homeowner yourself, you want to keep that person happy. You want to keep your customers happy by taking care of the property. So it is a win-win when you do that. But of course, sticking with the theme, it can be very expensive to do that. And it takes quite a bit of discipline and that mental energy that is so precious. It can be very easy to ignore problems and let them get much worse over time, just like any other business. But compare this to passive investing. You just buy an index fund or something like that, and you let the market do work, and you just call it a day once you buy the stock. Then that's all well and good. I mean, that has plenty of advantages. But let's talk about the disadvantages of that sort of thing compared to something like real estate. With something like passive investing, or even more active stock investing where you're picking individual stocks, I do quite a bit of that in my own portfolio. There are plenty of disadvantages with that approach compared to real estate too. Sure, it's more passive. Someone else is managing the portfolio, so you don't get those sorts of headaches. But at the same time, you lose out on the ability to influence change. If you have some sort of ability or knowledge, or you really think that the company should go in a particular direction, whether that opinion is warranted or not. But if you really do have some skill set that actually would be meaningful towards the company, if you were suddenly put in the CEO's position, then that's not really something you could do unless you buy out the whole company. But then we're back to square one, and all of a sudden the problems are yours. You're running the business. So there is a significant drawback there with the more passive style investing, or the more hands-off style where you buy the asset and that's about it. Now, with something like real estate, or running your own business, or taking a massive ownership in some business to where it becomes your own, you can still systematize things. And you're very much incentivized to do that. And it can be quite challenging at the beginning, but if you can get over that hurdle of creating those systems for real estate, finding a property manager, getting a good network of contractors going so that you can take care of these expensive problems when they come up in a time-efficient manner and in a high-quality manner so that the problems don't come up again or doesn't lead to other problems down the line, that you are very much incentivized to do. Whereas if you're doing a more passive approach, you're not really incentivized to do that. And that can limit your ability to grow at least as quickly, or at least scale as quickly, if that's something you're trying to do. If you're not trying to do that, then maybe it's not a big concern in your eyes. But if you can produce much higher returns through a more active style of investing, if you're buying properties yourself, you get to take advantage of the great financing terms out there, you get to take advantage of the tax benefits, the actual ability to force appreciation in the actual product, the actual real estate, by improving it and hiring contractors to do those improvements too, or do it yourself, whatever floats your boat. Whereas you can't really do that as easily with a more passive approach. You got to wait for the company to do its thing, or whatever asset you own. You're waiting more passively for that to happen. And that can take much longer than if you just took the reins yourself and did it. But of course, that takes a lot more energy in the short term too. But that ultimate payoff that you can get if you create good systems is massive. And I think much, much bigger than a more passive style of investing. If you can take the reins on building a business in real estate or elsewhere, but sticking with real estate, you can really drive massive returns that way, because you have the ability to make big moves that maybe a larger company wouldn't really be able to do as easily because they have lots of shareholders to appease. In the case of owning real estate yourself, you are the shareholder. You can call the shots. If you don't know what you're doing, that can be a liability. That can be a hindrance to your business. But if you can get some expertise going, or at least you deal with others who know what they're doing as well, and you can learn from them, you can really start to catapult yourself financially up the ladder to where you can actually make some big moves compared to something like a more passive approach, which might take a little longer, even if it's easier along the way. It's much like a risk-reward trade-off. Here, the risk is the time that you're actually putting towards something and the risk that it's not ultimately worth it. When you're putting more time towards something, you'd want more reward, potential reward on the other end. Otherwise, why are you putting so much time towards it? And with a more passive approach, you'd be putting less time towards something and you probably would expect a lower payout, but you're risking less because you're not putting as much time towards it most likely with that more passive style. And this is where you have to do a self-assessment. Do you have a skill set or the competency and the discipline to use your time effectively in some business, in running a real estate portfolio? Does that make more sense? Or maybe it makes more sense to go the passive route because maybe you don't have a particularly lucrative skill, or you just don't want to put the mental energy towards it. It simply would detract from other things in your life. And then you have to ask yourself, is it really worth it if it's making your life that much more miserable, even if you're making more money or you're producing more in your business? If you don't like doing it, then is it really worth it at all? In my case, I want to keep building my skill set in real estate because I believe the long-term payoff is going to be significantly higher than if I didn't. If I keep putting money towards good deals, if I keep learning new ways to improve properties in a cost-effective manner, if I learn new ways to spot issues so I avoid problems like this in the future, like getting a sewer scope, as I should have before I actually bought this property, because I probably would have found that crack sooner rather than later, that caused this whole overflow problem into my window here and all the damage associated with that. Learning things like that comes with experience, and you're not going to get as much experience with a more passive approach. So long term, thinking very long term, taking a more active approach, you should learn a lot more along the way too. And that will compound more than taking a more passive approach the entire time, most likely. But there's definitely something to be said about taking a more passive approach where you just put your money to work and you don't touch it ever again. And you build that discipline over time too, just knowing that your investments will do whatever they're going to do and you're not going to do much about it and just let them run. And at least statistically speaking, that has been a pretty viable strategy over the long term for many types of investments, mainly talking about the stock market here, because there's only so many passive types of investments out there where you can just put your money to work and let it go. It's typically in the equities market, but there are other things too, just buying shares of other people's businesses, for example, but the opportunities may be more limited compared to something like the public stock market, where you're going to find a lot of different opportunities out there. And that's assuming you're not just buying the entire market through something like a broad index fund. But the way I look at it, if I could become a better real estate investor, I know I have the ability to leverage my money in a very substantial way and can use that leverage effectively to create outsized returns compared to something like investing in the broad market. Now, if I totally didn't know what I was doing, but like I said, I'm definitely still learning a lot. I'm no expert, but I think I have enough competency in real estate to be able to produce pretty solid returns, and I expect to face problems in the short term. I respect those risks. So going in with that lens, I should be able to navigate those storms. I'm bringing reserves into deals and can learn along the way to avoid some of those risks in the future because I will have faced them before. I'll know what to look for beforehand, and then I won't have to deal with the problems when they would otherwise have arisen. So I definitely think owning real estate directly is worth it. It's definitely not as satisfying as actually improving something that was once bad into something good. This is going back to where I was essentially, so it's kind of making up lost ground, which is quite annoying. But again, that's what happens in real estate sometimes, and you got to be ready for it. And once I get through this problem, assuming I actually take care of it properly, it shouldn't really happen again for at least many decades, barring some freak event. So I really should be good, statistically speaking. I would expect to have far less problems, at least related to this sort of issue with the water coming in through the window because of a broken sewer pipe. That sewer pipe will be fixed, and that should be totally taken care of for, again, many decades or however long this actual repair lasts. Because going back to what we said at the very beginning of the video, everything has a useful life and you got to be ready to repair it. And through the many decades that I'll own this property, most likely, assuming I don't roll it into another one, another bigger deal or something like that, assuming I hold this thing for the very, very long term, which is the plan, then I'd be saving up reserves to eventually weather the storms that will come, those being the storms that inevitably come with owning a physical asset and actually running your own business. Real estate can be hard, especially when you're just starting out, but I ultimately think it is worth it if it's something that you're really looking to get into. Otherwise, I definitely wouldn't wish basement floods on anyone. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. So if you guys like this video, definitely like it since that would help the channel out a lot. And if you like this sort of content about real estate and investing, I put out new videos every single week and wouldn't want you guys to miss out. So be sure to subscribe and check out the free stuff and the affiliate links in the description below. But until next time, take care.